Hi folks, I'm Jess. I'm your friendly neighbourhood NDIS educator. I represent VMIAC, that is the Victorian Mental Illness Awareness Council. That fancy acronym is the bane of my existence sometimes because people ask me where I work and no one ever remembers. But it's fine because I'm very proud to work here and present this video to you today. We're the peak body for people with mental illness in Victoria, so we represent you. We are by and for consumers. Today we're going to be talking about barriers to the NDIS, and I'm going to be honest, there's a lot of them, and we're basically going to be talking about how to overcome those barriers. So my goal today is to really make the barriers to the NDIS less scary. So the analogy I would use for the NDIS barriers is that it's essentially like being a blindfolded hurdler. So if you were trying to jump hurdles with a blindfold on, that would be exceptionally difficult. But if you take the blindfold off, you can see what's ahead of you and actually, I'm pretty unclo. I don't know if I could jump hurdles without a blindfold on, but you know what I'm saying. If you know what's ahead of you, you can actually prepare, get ready, run up and time your jump just in time to get over. But that sounds like a lot. So let's break it down into manageable chunks. So one prime barrier to the NDIS is the language that is used. Throughout these videos, you would have heard some confusing words like permanent and significant. We're going to come on to some more confusing ones like reasonable and necessary. Is there a remedy? And sometimes it honestly feels like they're being confusing for confusing's sake. And I promise you that's not what they're doing. But it is a steep learning curve. You do have to acquaint yourself with the NDIS language and try and get as comfortable using it as you can so you can feel confident moving forward with your application. So I remember when I first saw the words that were about the NDIS and I thought I knew what they meant. So something like reasonable has a kind of intuitive meaning, like, oh yeah, it's reasonable, it's fair. But when the NDIS thinks of reasonable and fair, they have 6 other requirements that go into defining that word. And it just seems like a basic English word. English is my first language, but they have different definitions of these words, so you do really have to learn them and kind of play by their rules. My advice would be to study the NDIS language. So even make little flashcards or just practice, and if that's something that's too challenging for you, something that I've done in my daily life is try and explain the words to everyday people who aren't familiar with the NDIS. So I might explain to my friend or my partner, about what reasonable and necessary mean or what permanent and significant mean, just to get more used to using those words in my everyday life. And it can be a bit clunky and awkward at first, but you do get the hang of it. So another barrier to the NDIS is differing philosophies. So the NDIS will often use language like, is there a remedy and things like that. And when you live with mental illness, we often think about things in terms of a recovery model. So we might not think about things in terms of, I'm never going to get better from my mental illness, it's always going to be with me for life. We might think of it in terms of, I want to manage it better and I want to learn to understand it better and mitigate its impact on my life. So sometimes this sort of difference in philosophy, which comes from the fact that the NDIS wasn't designed for mental illness or psychosocial disability, can sort of be off-putting for some people and a bit confusing as well. This can lead to mixed feelings when applying for the NDIS, and I think that's because it's such a model of deficit. And when you've been in the psychological healthcare system, a lot of the time you're talking to your psychologists. I know one time I got my psychologist to write a note for an extension I needed on my thesis, and they wrote this section being like, oh, Jess is a wonderful client to work with and she really wants to get better. And I said to her, you can't have that in there. It's just, you can't talk about it in those terms because it's often supposed to be about deficit. And that can be really challenging and difficult to sort of come to terms with. So frankly, the NDIA or the NDIS aren't particularly interested in hearing about your strengths, which I can promise you have many and I have many, we all do. But it really is a deficit model where you need to emphasize where you're struggling, and it's difficult acknowledging where you're struggling and why you're struggling. So stripping yourself bare and showing all of those impairments can be quite challenging, but it's just, I think I mentioned it in the last video, it's really important to remember that this is just the NDIS's framework. This is how they view you, it's not how you have to view you. And that's the way you get support. So you honestly have to play by their rules. And once you've got the support, it's there for life and you can live the life that you want to. So it's about, considering those strengths and weaknesses or counterbalancing what you're sacrificing or what you're risking by applying, and the potential benefit. So another barrier to the NDIS, you won't believe this, is your doctors, because a lot of doctors really don't have as much education about the NDIS as they should. And it's very difficult for them in terms of they're used to just filling in medical certificates saying X was sick for this day, blah, blah, blah. Very basic forms, whereas the forms that you actually need and the evidence you need for the NDIS is quite lengthy and actually needs to be quite personalised, and that's not something doctors are always prepared to do, either because they don't have the knowledge or also because they don't have the time. So the NDIS is still really new, and it's kind of like a wee little baby at this stage. It's growing and people don't necessarily know how to interact with it. So you need to potentially, with your doctors, go in there as formed as possible, watch our videos, listen to podcasts, read any kind of material you can get out there, get along to webinars and things like that, so that you can go in as informed as possible and say to your doctor, this is what I need from you. Another thing you can do is actually write up a script. So you can go in there and say, you know, these are the things I struggle with, and have it written down in a form and just ask your doctor, can you sign this? Are you happy to put your name to it? It saves them time, it saves them effort, and it gets you the support you need. Win-win. Another further barrier to NDIS funding is the assessors. So I don't want to paint them in a bad light. They're hardworking people, but they've just been trained in a certain way and trained to think about the NDIS in a certain way that doesn't always incorporate mental illness or psychosocial disability. So unfortunately, mental illness was kind of slapped on at the end when they were developing the Act, the NDIS Act. And so people haven't necessarily been trained to understand how mental illness works. They're much more familiar with physical and intellectual disabilities. So that's just something to consider when you're applying, is to work really hard to make your invisible illness visible to them so that it's more tangible to them and so that they can understand it. So if you're talking about self-care, you can say things like, I don't shower for a week, and things like that. So make it really clear to them how you are impaired. Just saying that you have a diagnosis of schizophrenia or bipolar or borderline isn't going to be enough. You need to show how you specifically struggle, because that puts it in terms that they understand. The final barrier we'll be talking about in this video is deadlines. So when I think about the NDIS deadlines, I think about them in a rule that I call the 28-3-28 rule. So when you receive your access request form, you need to submit it within 28 days. If you're not happy with a decision made by the NDIS, you need to apply for a review within 3 months. If your review is unsuccessful, you need to apply for an Administrative Appeals Tribunal, AAT. I don't say that very often. You saw I struggled with that. I say AAT. But you need to apply for that within 28 days as well. So it's 28-3-28. Now these deadlines can be really challenging if you live with a psychosocial disability or mental illness, because often you're struggling enough as it is, so to apply and fit into these deadlines can be really difficult, and I don't think that's always accounted for by the NDIS. But there are ways around this. You can get extensions throughout all these different stages in the process, and these can help you to better gather your evidence and prepare yourself for these different stages in the process. So as you can see, there are many different barriers to accessing the NDIS, but there are also many ways of overcoming those barriers. Sometimes you have to work a little bit hard and sort of a little bit of wiggle room, but it can be really worthwhile. Next time, we'll be talking about all the different sorts of supports you can and can't get on the NDIS. And I really encourage you to look at all of our different resources we have on our website, the VMIAC website, VMIAC. And we'll have our podcasts, our blogs, our YouTube videos, and we're really hoping to diversify. I don't even know what sorts of things will be up there this time next year. We're really opening up the space. So I look forward to seeing you on there and seeing you in future videos. I've been Jess. See you next time. Bye.